So over the last couple of years, actually it's 2022, I think, was when we had a meeting in September, and we were joined by Fareed Zakaria that encouraged us to look at how perhaps the world that we've known so far, economics drove geopolitics, and that perhaps that's reversed, where geopolitics is driving the bus. And those of us that work in the economic sphere have to be thinking more about geopolitics going forward. And I think that comment has resonated amongst our members, and a lot of the discussions we've been having since then have focused on that. And certainly, current events have reemphasized the importance of geopolitics and how it is impacting us, even in the commercial real estate investing space. And it's changing the way we think, changing the way we do that. But it's a difficult learning curve, I think, for a lot of us that grew up in our professions in the 90s and the 2000s to really kind of rethink how history is coming back. History is not over. And there is this need, I think, for all of us to learn from people that really do focus on history.
You are listening to the AFIRE podcast, real estate, technology, cross-border investing, and the opportunities of a changing world. Let's start a conversation now.
I am really glad that Dr. Michael Neiberg, who's a historian, an American historian that specializes in the 20th century, military history in particular. He is the chair of war studies, the Department of National Security at the U.S. Army War College, and will be speaking at the AFIRE meeting in September of 2025. We're sitting here in July of 2025. A lot of things have happened. Certainly, we had a large bill suddenly go through Congress and get approved by the president, which changes some things politically and certainly seems to be a continued step back from a free global trade environment. So I'm especially glad to be able to talk to Michael Neiberg here today on the AFIRE podcast. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Always great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
It does seem like there's many echoes from the last 100 years in terms of what happens as we pull back from a kind of a free global trade environment and start to kind of pull back to our countries. How do you see this as being reflected maybe in early 20th century and mid 20th century history?
Well, as an historian, I'm sort of trained to look for similarities and differences. I'm trained to look for change and continuity and never to make too simplistic an analogy because, of course, what we're dealing with now is not the same as what other time periods. I'm working on a book on 1937 right now, and some of those parallels can lead you down some pretty terrifying places if you let them. And you have to remind yourself that every historical period is unique. But you can certainly see if you take a 35,000-foot view of the 20th century. I keep going back to John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist who was so influential in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century. And Keynes wrote this retrospective sort of talking about the years before the First World War, in which he talked about a romantic period when you could move people and goods across borders with almost no paperwork, that borders in Europe for trade were wide open despite some of the geopolitical problems that existed. The First World War destroyed that system and utterly destroyed it. And I think one thing as an historian I might point out is that the period we're going back to is actually kind of more of the norm. The period that you spoke about, that post-Cold War end of history, everybody's going to be happy period, is in fact the sort of exception in the 20th century. And we are in some ways reverting to norm, although as you know, we're doing it for geopolitical reasons. There's nothing natural about that reversion either. So looking at it from that perspective, you can see a kind of arc that goes from 1914 to about 1989 of increasing restrictions, especially as half of the world is shut off to trade through the Cold War and through the imperial system and all the other things we could talk about. Then you see this brief kind of opening up, the so-called end of history, as I mentioned, that became such a popular thing in Francis Fukuyama's book on the subject and others. And now we are reverting back. So I think one of the questions to ask is which is the quote-unquote normal state of affairs in geopolitics and which is the one that you really have to work hard to make sure it exists?
Well, one of the concerns I often have when we start using the word normal or return to normal is that we fixate on that. We fixate on, some sort of imagined normalcy as opposed to we're constantly moving through various changes and we have to respond to what we have, what is in front of us right now, as opposed to pining for a golden era. But that seems to be human nature, right? We look back and we try to find our way back to something that we liked before. But going forward, what do you think as things are emerging, do you see what some of those parallels or what some of those lessons might be learned in terms of how the world reacted, certainly in 100 years ago, to some of these shift. We have a big shift in that we had a pandemic. Certainly, you had that in the early 20th century. You had some economic instability. You had countries that were becoming more volatile. You had more nationalism. You had more populism rising, and maybe a shift, if you will, to more kind of totalitarian thinking. All these kinds of things were coming together. What are the parallels? I mean, and I don't want to be too simplistic, but what are the lessons that we can learn as we're thinking about how we navigate what is perhaps more normal now, less free, maybe a little more friction? How do you think investors should navigate this from a kind of international perspective as we cross borders?
Well, it's a complicated, geeky historical answer, but the phrase that we academics, historians would use is that there is no teleology in history. And what that means is history is not moving towards some sort of golden end state, or as you put it, some sort of normal state. That the conditions of economics are interrelated with the conditions in security and in politics and in society and culture. And they're also subject to contingencies, like you said, a global pandemic that hits or a global economic crisis as hit in 2008. Some of what we're seeing now is still a function of all of that, a lack of faith in institutions that happened in the wake of 2008 and happened in the wake of COVID. So I think one thing, it's complicated, and it's why we historians aren't normally asked to give advice to too many senior leaders, because our answer is this is really complicated and everything is interrelated and connected to everything else. So as the economic picture around the world gets better or gets worse, it's going to affect the way that politics get involved. I think from my perspective, the two things that I would most point to is whether or not we are entering this period that the French have developed this phrase, Polycrisis. Are we entering a phrase where all these various global crises, from Taiwan to North Korea to Iran to Russia, are they merging? Are they coming into one big crisis that we're going to have to deal with? Because if that's the case, obviously, we have a level of problem we haven't been dealing with up to this point. And the second one, of course, and you would know much more about this than I would, is whether the global economy can continue to sustain some of the shocks that it has been receiving. I think we all expected, I don't know if you would agree, that the American military attack and Israeli attack on Iran would have created a greater economic shock than it did. I think we should all be glad that it did not, but it could easily have gone a different way.
Easily. And I think that is the concern, not just in the United States, but certainly in Western Europe, as they're looking at, the impact of Ukraine on their economies. I think we're shifting, to be honest. I think, when we talk about shocks or disruptions to the economy, again, I think the danger is to think about there being a steady state. It's always in flux. It's always changing.
I agree.
And I think some of the rules of the road are illusory to a certain extent, that the rules are there because they will change as economies change where they're focused. So think about how Russia has changed its economy to a war economy. That so much of their economic success right now is being driven by Ukraine. It's so closely tied.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, that's true also in Western countries as we look at, military preparedness and the kind of economics of having standing armies that now have to actually act upon what they've been training for. It is changing our economies, and perhaps more than we realize. It's certainly changing also where the demand is. And I think that's part of what's interesting as we think about when politics and economics collide, or maybe they're always intertwined. We just, we give ourselves the illusion that they aren't. How have you seen in your history, in your research, how some of those factors have intersected in the past? And what about that do you think is interesting for folks that are thinking about the intersection going forward?
Yeah, I think one thing to avoid, it's another geeky academic term, but it's continuity bias, the presumption that the state that we're in is the state that we will be in the future. So
Right.
I think we were guilty of this with Russia, where we just did not want to believe that Russia was going to be this malignant actor that was going to threaten and disrupt the entire security system that our architecture and European architecture was built on. I'm still a little surprised that the 2014 takeover of Crimea was not the wake-up call to us and to the Europeans. So one thing we have to be careful of is assuming that everything is going to continue to be the way that it is, because that's the way that it is.
Right.
And we have to look for actors and factors in the system that want to change it, and actors and factors in the system that want to keep it the same, and judge their relative strength. And Russia is clearly an actor. China is clearly an actor that wants to change aspects of the system. We have been, although we've been pushing for change in some areas, we have been largely arguing for the system to remain relatively the same. So I think some of it is that it's a contest between those that are satisfied with the status quo in one level or another, and those that are revisionist and want to upend that status quo and see where their relative power and capability is. I think we know now what Russia's intent is. It's a question of measuring whether their capabilities will match that intent and how much damage they intend to do to the European structure beyond just Ukraine.
It also seems that there is what you're describing on an international basis certainly is also playing out domestically, I think, within individual countries as we're trying to kind of navigate between change and not change. And at the same time, we seem to be in an environment which there is a cycle that a lot of people have commented on, that every 80 years or so, there is a significant sea change in terms of technological capability that challenges the way things have always been done in the past. And we seem to be potentially in one of those periods right now where technology is changing dramatically, potentially, certainly with AI, certainly in terms of how we engage militarily. It has changed significantly just in the last couple of years. We've seen a rapid change in terms of how we look at it. Do you see important parallels to some of the technological shifts that were occurring in the first half of the 20th century that we might be able to learn from?
Yeah, I actually think this information technology that we're in revolution that we're going under is actually greater than any of those things, except for potentially the atomic bomb, and maybe even in some ways greater for its impacts on that. So, what we talk about as historians when we talk about major revolutions, we talk about a change in the groups of people that are in charge. We talk about a change in the ways that power is distributed, and we see all those things happening with the information revolution. So I think what we're actually seeing is something on par with the Industrial Revolution, where it is a new type of person that is gaining wealth and power. It is a new source of wealth and power, and it is changing the very nature by which we are governed.
Mm-hmm.
So much of the AI work that I've been doing here at the War College has been motivated in part by the fear that this is happening really, really quickly around us, and we're having a difficult time keeping up with it because
Right.
it's changing so quickly. It is literally changing the way that democracies function and the way that economies function. And I don't think that our laws, our norms, our governance is anywhere near close to catching up with it. So in some ways, I think the revolution is even greater than some of the technological revolutions that we've seen even earlier in the 20th century.
Well, that being said, how is it changing then governance? I mean, certainly we can see it easily in terms of the economy and business and how people are doing things, but how do you see it changing governance at this point?
It's been interesting watching the Europeans and the way that they've responded. The Europeans have taken a very different approach to AI and to data more generally than have the Americans. And you know this, I'm sure, from your travels too. The Europeans have taken a much more people first, consumer first, protection of data first approach than the United States has. So what you're seeing in the United States is a much more open investment, business, technological environment than you're seeing in Europe. And this has caused a real change in the relationship between this technology and governance. It's had a more of an impact here in the United States, I think, than it has had in Europe, though it's starting to happen in Europe, of course, as well. So what you're seeing, I think, is a real change in the way that people are getting information. It's changing the way that they're thinking about that information. And that in turn is changing the way that people are voting. It's changing the way they're thinking about the subjects that they're interested in. We've already seen the massive impact that it's had on traditional media and the way that people got their information at a basic level. That is completely revolutionized from what we've seen. And I think we're starting to see the effects of that in governance as well.
You can make the argument that we tend to dismiss the importance of changes in media, that along with these kind of big changes in history, there's always this big change in media that takes place at the same time. So even though it's, a lot of it's entertainment, a lot of it's, useless gossip, it's whatever it
Yeah.
is, but how we get information from each other has presaged incredible seismic change. I mean, think back to the Gutenberg Bible
Mm-hmm.
and the 100 years of European conflict that followed as people were adjusting to the fact that someone could write something and people could read something that is, tacked to the church door or something along those lines. Same thing happened, I think, in terms of mass media 100 years ago in terms of, the impact. And we had to somehow understand, that if we saw something in a newsreel, how skeptical we had to be in terms of receiving it, or,
Hmm.
what is news. And that same revolution seems to be taking place right now, where we don't understand the information. We're not able to sort the information that we're getting. Is this real? Is this not real? And it seems like it's only accelerating. Even though we're able to communicate in ways that we never could before, now we're having a hard time understanding it. It seems to me. I mean, it seems like the military in particular has gone through various phases of trying to figure out how to sort the noise from the signal, if you will. Do you see similar parallels as you look through history in terms of how communication may be an important thing for us to pay closer attention to?
Absolutely, I think we should. I had a fascinating conversation a couple of years ago with someone who was a very young journalist when Yasser Arafat was interviewed by, I think, 60 Minutes. And the point this journalist made is that in those days, it was the only way for someone like Yasser Arafat to get a message out to the West. He
Right.
needed something like 60 Minutes. What that meant was 60 Minutes was going to send an incredibly experienced journalist who knew how to talk to someone like that, who knew how to do that interaction. Now, of course, all they have to do is open a social media account and platform whatever they want with no filter, no interaction, no check on it whatsoever. So you have this kind of flooding of the information space. What's different about social media, of course, is that anybody can put that information into that space. It's not filtered or regulated in any way that it has been in the past. There
Mhm.
may be benefits to that, but I think we can all agree, maybe we can't all agree, but I would put forth that it's had a lot of negative impacts on the way that people writ large have interacted with information and the way that they've been subject to misinformation, especially with the way that the Russians, especially, have just turned this into a diplomatic espionage misinformation machine that has been incredibly effective in terms of a return on investment for the amount of money that they've had to put into it.
Absolutely. And I think we dismiss the value of that filtering, that dialogue, at our own jeopardy. I
I
mean,
agree.
that we need that. It doesn't matter who the actor is. It could be someone with all the best intentions and who's doing the right things. But if they're communicating completely without the resistance of other people talking to them, without dialogue, a lot of the message, it can be distorted. It can be missed in so many ways. I think the importance of that kind of conversation needs to always be there, and it needs to somehow get us closer to an objective view, which is not easy. It takes a lot of skill. It takes, to your point, a skilled journalist that has been doing this a long time, and even then they make mistakes. But I'm always struck by how much it takes time for a population to understand how to receive the communication, not just how to deliver it. Certainly, we've learned, a lot of people have learned how to do podcasts or how to communicate through media. How to receive it is much more difficult. I mean, think about the power that advertising had, even in the last 50 to 75 years ago. It had so much more power than it has today. Simply someone saying that a product is going to make you successful with with your dating, or make you happy, people would buy it, and they bought it at an incredible rate. It didn't take as much energy to convince people to do something, because we still hadn't understood television. We didn't understand, how to receive it. And then with the evolution of television through cable and through streaming, now we're not quite sure how to consume it either. We have a much more concentrated version. It's like, well, we figured out how to drink a beer without, getting sloppy, but maybe we haven't figured out how to, drink a, Everclear without getting sloppy. It's like we need to learn not just how to deliver, but how to receive the communication that we're receiving.
And I think a part of that is learning how to do that in a civic minded, thoughtful, debating way. The reason why I don't discuss anything political on social media is it is not a space that's designed for that. It
No.
is a space that is designed for yelling and screaming and being uncivil. And I think what we've lost in this transition is the ability to have these civil discussions. And this is not an argument that everybody in the past always had a civil discussion with one another, but it is an argument to say that one thing that the social media space has done is really made it difficult to have those conversations. I can count, I think, on one hand, the number of political discussions I've had on social media that have started civil and remained civil, even when people were disagreeing. It's just not built for that. So I think that's what we've lost. And what that's done is it has polarized views, and it has made the intelligent, thoughtful disagreement in the center almost impossible to do.
But I would argue that all medias go through a period like that. When you think about the emotionality of early printed media, you look at the emotionality of early radio, of early television, of early film, part of the reason why the rise of Nazism was particularly effective was the use of media. And it was very emotional. It was very polarizing. Think about what was happening even in the United States during the 1930s in terms of some of the more extreme actors, a Father Coughlin or something along those lines. It was incredibly polarizing, incredibly emotional.
Yeah.
It was us versus them. It was driving through resentment and even amplifying it, which, again, the argument is being made that that's what social media is doing right now. It's almost like we haven't learned the rules of how to play, where emotionality, polarization is kept is restrained, if you will. Learning how to restrain in this environment. And I'd agree with you. Social media at this point is not the place to be arguing politics because it has become so polarized. But maybe we'll learn how. I don't know.
There is an argument, at least in the early days of social media, that this was going to be a more democratic way of media because it wouldn't be controlled by a group of people that filtered out what came and what didn't. And there's certainly an argument to be made for that. But I think what we've also found out is that there is a role for a newspaper editor who says, I'm going to print this letter to the editor, but I'm not going to print that one. There is a role for people like that in the system. The difficult thing for me as an historian, it is easy for me to see the propaganda message that somebody is trying to send, whether it's the Nazi Party or whomever it might be.
Right.
It is more difficult for me to understand the way that people received that information. And it's really difficult to know whether they're receiving it because the propaganda is convincing them of something they did not previously believe, or whether it's pushing on an open door, if you will. I tend to think it's the latter, that propaganda succeeds when it's already speaking to a truth that people believe, that it's already speaking to something that is getting to them. And here we get back to the point we started with. If economic times are good and somebody's trying to sell you a message of the sky is falling, my guess is it's less likely to succeed. Whereas if economic times are bad, government institutions don't seem to be responding to things like COVID or the 2008 economic crisis correctly, then a space does open up for propaganda to push on what people are already thinking and what people are already feeling. So I just don't know that there's an easy way, at least for me looking backwards, pre-Gallup polling and pre-whatever else, to really get a sense of which is the chicken and which is the egg. So as an historian, you'll never get someone to write a letter and say, well, I was listening to Father Coughlin on the radio and he said this, and well, kind of I think he's right about this, but not right about this. And, we don't have that. So it's really, really difficult for me as a scholar to go back and which is causing people to do what. And my guess is it is the situation that is making people susceptible to propaganda, not the other way around. So Joseph Goebbels couldn't do what he did in 1923 or 1953, but in 1933, he's got an audience that is already willing to listen to the grievances that he's pushing forward.
So let me get beyond then, what causes it or how it becomes, as we are now in an environment of polarization, which is similar, how we've pulled back from that. We've recovered from that. And we've gotten to periods of time and maybe almost like, seas of order, in an ocean of chaos. But what have we done to pull back from polarization? What causes that? How can we as actors, and all of us are actors, whether we're on the economic side or on the political side, the military side, we're all actors in this. We are all co-creating this. How can we pull ourselves back from that precipice, or how do we recover from this?
Well, I think if you look back at periods of time, the period of American history when there was kind of the least amount of polarization is during the height of the Cold War, when there was an obvious threatening outside enemy. I think you could make the case that while many people in the United States recognize what Russia and China and other actors are up to, they don't feel the threat in the same way that we did during the early 1960s or when the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb or Sputnik or any of those moments. The threat is still sort of over there. I think that's one thing that can help to reduce levels of polarization. The other, of course, is economic stability. If the economy seems to be growing and seems to be reaching a lot of people, there's less room for grievance. But again, I would point out as an historian that the polarization and the political anger is a norm in American history. But we have gone through these periods a lot in our history, and they have not always turned out well. They have produced civil wars. They have produced all kinds of problems, the civil rights movement, the violence associated with that. So it's not the case that Americans, by our nature, are to agree on everything. What I think is different now, and there's plenty of evidence to document it, is the inability of the two parties and people who subscribe to the two parties to agree on basic truths. That's what's getting different, and that's what's creating a level of polarization that we haven't seen in quantitative terms before.
You talk about economic stability and success economically, and you can look at the current economic situation, even on a global basis, in a couple of different ways. So part of your noting that the different parties have different truths or the different kind of interpretations of what's going on is that on the one hand, you have more money washing through the system than there ever has been in human history. There's more wealth than there has ever been. But not unlike the Gilded Age, it's very concentrated amongst winners versus the losers. And you have a lot of people that feel left behind by the wealth that has been created just in the last few decades. I think it's interesting to me that, and it may be, again, this is me as an amateur. I have no idea from other than I'm a consumer of historians like yourself, and the words and the thoughts that you bring. But is that a useful way of thinking about the economic impact on people's resentment or the polarization? Because again, when we look at these periods of high polarization, there's an economic factor here where there's a lot of people that are not winning.
And a lot of that, of course, is tied to politics. It's tied to policy. So not all of that can be explained by free market or can be explained by basic economic principles. A lot of these are political choices. And I know in Europe, at least, a lot of the anger came from people in the wake of the 2008 crisis who believed that the politicians had made decisions that had increased the gap between the rich and the poor. They had, in effect, bailed out banks, they bailed out insurance companies, some of that anger here in the United States as well, without addressing the needs of people who felt that they had been most disadvantaged. So that's, again, to get back to what we started with, the connection between economics and political policy. They're not separable because the two clearly are impacting and affecting one another. We also have the situation in the United States where the economy seems to be doing much better than most people think that it is, which is an interesting phenomenon as well. People tend to be more pessimistic about the economy than the numbers would seem to bear. That's either an indication that they don't believe that this is sustainable, or as you said, they don't believe that the benefits are being distributed in a way that makes sense to them. So those are economic decisions, but they are also clearly political ones.
At the same time, you talked about having a common enemy. And I remember some people were talking, especially a few years ago, about how a potential common enemy of all human beings is the race against climate change. Or, this, and again, it's not as acute as someone, coming, sending drones to bomb your city, but it is a very real threat, and a threat that we're seeing an acceleration of problems. So everything from global migration patterns to just higher risk and higher storm damage, higher uncertainty in terms of what's happening in the built environment. Do you see this ever becoming that shared enemy that can help kind of unify and get us beyond our differences, which the differences won't go away, but allow us to kind of work together and to see each other as friends, as colleagues that are fighting against a common enemy?
I'm not sure. I think we're closer in Europe than we are in the United States. I just came back from my fifth or sixth once-in-a-generation heat wave in France, and they're coming closer to that, I think, than we are here in the United States, because it is impacting them on a daily life situation more than it is here in the United States. I think another example I might point to is the situation in the Nordic states, in Estonia, in places in Finland that live very close to Russia, which there is still political disagreement, of course. It's not to say that everybody gets along, but there is a greater trust in the system and a greater belief in the necessity of everybody to work together, because there is this external threat that could destroy absolutely everything. So there's a trust in government and a trust in the system in those Nordic states that we simply don't have here in the United States. And that's not only because we lack the common enemy the way that they do, or we don't interpret it the same way. It's also a long history in the United States of being less willing to cede things to the government than has been true in many of the Nordic states. But when I go to Estonia and Finland and I look at the way their systems function, my just our history will just not allow us to cede that much control to a central government authority the way that they do in the Nordic states. And part of that is history, part of that is tradition, but a large part of that is they live next to the Russian bear, and they recognize that they're going to need to work together, and they're going to need to make some sacrifices if a crisis ever does come to pass.
It does seem that Russia's activities in Ukraine has increased the strength, at least of the European alliance, to a certain extent. I mean, it's not perfect, but it does seem like suddenly it's relevant again, and the success of NATO is more important to the participants in NATO. Perhaps not the U.S. at the moment, but the rest of Europe seems to be much more committed, especially in the Nordics, than they were before. I think it's kind of interesting.
So I may be just spitballing here, but I think as an historian, a lot of this is a debate over the nature of history. This is especially true in Germany, where the belief at the end of the Cold War was that you had closed this very violent moment from 1914 to 1989. We could now put that period behind us, and we could move forward into a future in which the 20th century's wars would be a thing of the past. They would be antediluvian, and you would move into a 21st century that would be based on trade. It would be based on mutual economic interdependence. And that version of history just didn't play itself out. And I think it went through a lot of European states, but Germany, I think, most of all. And I think it's been a very difficult awakening to realize that their understanding of history and what that implied for the present and the future has just proven to be wrong. And now what you're seeing, I think, is not just a political problem in Europe, and it's not just an economic problem in Europe. It really is a problem of waking up to the reality that you had misread where history was going, and you had made a fundamental mistake in believing that war was the abnormality in European history, and that something had gone wrong from 1914 to 1989, when in fact, security has to be protected and it has to be defended. And competition between nation states, especially when one of them is Russia, seems to be a norm of European history. So in my view, when I talk to European security people, a lot of this is just getting people to rethink what their view of the past is and what that means for the present, and especially what it means as we go forward into the future.
That's a fascinating way of looking at it. And I do wonder, as we are arguing over what is happening right now, certainly in the media in the United States, what is real, what is truth, depends on, which outlet you listen to, or, which podcaster you're listening to, that may be a similar kind of event, a similar process that we're going through.
I think it is
trying to understand, all right, what is our shared truth? What is our shared understanding, or the context for the things that are happening? We see the same, we're seeing a somewhat similar kind of thing that's happening, whether it's an invasion in Ukraine or it's storm damage in Texas. How do we interpret that? How do we interpret the meaning of it, and where do we go with that? And right now we are far apart in terms of understanding that, but maybe it is more of a process of awakening, of understanding that the shared context of the past certainly doesn't apply, that we need to construct a new one in terms of understanding what's going on right now. Would you agree?
I would, and I think we're seeing some of it in the United States as well as it revolves in Europe. There is a view of some Americans that the transatlantic alliance is a history of great success, that the U.S. has invested in it, invested heavily in it, and that has been the reason for its success. You have another group of Americans who believe that this history is a history of the Europeans consistently delaying or not spending on defense because they expected the United States to do it. And those two histories imply very different things about what that transatlantic relationship ought to look like going forward. They're not necessarily mutually incompatible, but they don't overlap as well as they did, say, during the Cold War period, when there was a general consensus on what this meant. So part of it is a debate over history. It's a debate on what you think the past is. And of course, this is probably a subject for another podcast, but when you hear Vladimir Putin and people in Russia talk, it is as if they're speaking about a completely different planet, because their history is so at variance with the history of the West.
What do you think people get most wrong when they're thinking about the importance of history and using history to understand, as a lens to understand what's going on today and what could be going on? What do you think we get wrong that drives you bananas? You're like, gee, if only the rest of the world understood what I understand as a historian.
Well, I think there's two things. I think I get frustrated as a professional historian when people use history to support their own cognitive bias, that whatever it is they want to believe in the present, they will cherry pick from the past in order to prove that point, and will do so relatively uncritically and without a lot of nuance. And the second thing I would really love for people to know is that history is really, really complicated, and that it changes depending upon where you go and who you're talking to. And what I try to instill in the officers that I teach here is, if you understand the way a group of people think historically, it is almost like playing poker against somebody and finding their tell. Because if you understand the way their society thinks about the past, you can understand how they're going to react to events in the present and in the future. And there's no better example of that, again, different podcast for this, than the way
Right.
that Israel has been responding militarily in the last couple of months, and the way that Russia and Ukraine have been responding. It is entirely based on their view of the past and where they think that means they're going in the present and the future. So what I try to tell our students here is, history is not about, how many tanks did George Patton have at Bastogne? It is really about, how can I understand my own country's history, but maybe just as importantly, how can I pick up that tell when I'm playing poker against the other side, and what advantage can that give me intellectually and conceptually?
That is fascinating. And I think to a certain extent is probably a lesson that I think a lot of investors need to take away as well, is understanding someone else's point of view on history. What is their history versus ours? I think that, what an incredible insight into how to interact in a very complex and uncertain environment, to understand someone else's history. That's just wonderful. I hope we'll hear a lot more about that in September at the annual meeting for AFIRE, where you are one of our guest speakers. Looking very much forward to your insights there. We have, of course, been speaking with Dr. Michael Neiberg, who is the chair of war studies at the Department of National Security at the U.S. Army War College. And thank you so much, Michael, for being a part of this podcast.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to September.
You've been listening to the AFIRE podcast. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast subscription service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitchers, and others. AFIRE is not engaged in providing tax, accounting, or legal advice. No content in this podcast is to be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. Some information included has been obtained from third-party sources considered to be reliable, though AFIRE is not responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy of third-party information. The opinions expressed are those of its respective contributors and sources, and do not necessarily reflect those of AFIRE.